All right, guys, will it drain? That is a question we're answering today. Should you get a perk test on your land flips? And I don't know why this is a question that frankly no one could answer for me when I first got started. So let's dive into it. Now, before we do, just a quick announcement. We have added a 6-figure guarantee to Leah. That is our 12-month group coaching program for land investors. 6 figures in gross pipeline profit in 12 months, where we will work with you until you get there. That is a guarantee. And boy, that is a crazy guarantee. Landinvestor.co/apply to learn more. So for you guys that don't know, what is a perk test? Essentially, a perk test is where they dig a little hole in your property and see how quickly the water will drain through it. And it's really a way to validate if a septic system is going to work on your property. And I'm not a septic system rocket scientist. Really, we're not going to dive into how septic systems are made and leach fields and all that stuff. Really, all I want to know here today is if I'm a land flipper and I'm looking to buy land with the intent of resell, should I waste my time or money potentially on getting a perk test? So a few things that we want to consider. First things first, how much is a perk test going to cost? Super variable. On the low ends, $400 to $500. On the high end, maybe $2,000. Honestly, you should probably be in like the low $1,000, $1,200 range on average. So that's what I expect to spend, but it is variable, like almost every other third-party expense in land investing. I've seen it run the whole gamut. Timelines also variable. We're getting a perk test on a property right now. Took them 2 days to get out there. In some cases, it could take 60 days for them to get out there to run the test. And that's where things start to get a bit complex. If you have a quick closing and they can't get out there for months, it definitely becomes a real thorn in our side. So this is what we want to think about. Before we spend the money or spend the time trying to get a perk test, we want to ask ourselves a few key questions that should inform us that this is even going to be relevant to our property. Okay. The first thing that I always look at is, hey, does it even need a septic system, right? If it's on city sewer, there's almost no reason it should need a perk test, right? Because ultimately a perk test is typically just a way to validate if a septic system is going to make sense in the property. So when we're dealing with really rural properties outside of city limits, that's where septic systems become potentially imperative. Now, we have to think about ultimately what is the use case, because every property without sewer is not going to be a given just that it's going to be built on to have a residential use case. There are many large properties outside of city limits where no one's ever going to build. So I do want to think, even if it does or doesn't have sewer, what is the use case here? Now, if we're dealing with an infill lot in a city without sewer, it most definitely has one use case, and that is to be built on. Now, if it's a 50 acre, that's more of a hunting property, and it's 5 hours outside of a city, being built on it might not be an issue. Or maybe someone puts an outhouse on it and puts a hunting blind. So I do want to be keenly aware of, A, does it have sewer today? Will it need a septic system? Is that even relevant to the potential use case of this property? Now, there are other reasons people might get a perk test, but today we're just going to be thinking about it from the lens of, is someone going to build on this for a residential purpose? Now, the next thing I look at is the adjacent property. So I look at, are any of the adjacent lots built on? More than likely, an adjacent property probably has similar features, probably has similar soil, probably has similar perk rates. So I want to think about, what are the neighbors doing? And the neighbors can act as a pretty good proof of concept for us. That's a really easy thing to check on Data Tree or Land Vision or Land ID, wherever you go and do your mapping. Plug in the APN and go look at the surrounding properties. Now, I want to let you know that none of these are an insurance policy. None of these are guaranteed, but these are little cues that we start to stack up to clue me in on what direction I might have to go. The next thing is I look at, are there any bodies of water or flood zones, wetlands on the property? That is definitely going to affect the drainage rate of the property. And so if you've got a property that has tons of wetlands or flood zones on it or big giant pond on it, it's a smaller property, what's a question I might start asking myself, right? To me, it's one of the dead giveaways. The next thing is typically a dead giveaway is, what's the slope of the property? The property is extremely slopey, it becomes even more questionable that it might perk. And so for me, wet properties and slopey properties are really big triggers of like, okay, this could be an issue. Now, there's also like regions that really suffer from bad soil, places like the Carolinas and parts of the Southeast. Like those are areas that are notorious to have really crummy soil that makes it really difficult to get properties to perk. So you also do want to be keenly aware of what's the context of the area I'm in, what's typical out here. And in fact, it's so fascinating. Some of those markets, having a perk test is like having a golden ticket. I mean, not only will your property sell faster, but it sells at a huge premium relative to the $500 or the $1,000 you invested in the deal. But again, that only comes with the context of understanding your property and understanding the market that you're in. The next thing I think about is, what's the size of the property, right? Now, when someone does a perk test, they might do it on multiple parts of the property, and some parts might not perk and some parts may perk. And so having a larger property essentially gives you more shots on goal. A smaller property that's really wet, that's really slopey with no neighbors that have any homes built on them, you can see how these start to stack up and they start to kind of work again, to where closing would be contingent on a perk test, right? And the last thing I think about is the diversity of the property. So you might have a wet property, as a slopey property, it has a lot going on with it, right? But if it's diverse enough and you do have sections or regions of the property that are flat, that aren't wet, again, that gives us more shots on goal. And so I'm not going to throw out a property immediately because it might have a 30% slope on it and it has flood zones and wetlands. If there are areas that are obviously flat, that are obviously dry, again, it gives us some hope that, hey, this may perk. Now, I'm still going to get a perk test, but there are some properties to me that are so blatantly not going to be a good fit for a septic system. A 50-degree slope, crazy flood zone, wetlands, bodies of water, just all sorts of funkiness. In fact, those properties raise other red flags like, are they even buildable? One of the constraints for is a property buildable is, can you get a septic system on? A lot of unbuildable properties, they usually suffer from, they just don't perk. Now, the cool thing is there are septic alternatives out there that are way above my head that I don't really understand that well. And properties can certainly still have value, even if they don't perk. But like I always say, price is the ultimate resolution, okay? You might have a property that does not perk that you thought was going to be a buy for 30, sell at 60 if it did perk. Now that it doesn't, maybe it's a buy at 8, sell at 16, right? Our math always has to get adjusted. And there are some properties where it's just not even worth the brain damage or the headache, even if there is spread there, because I'll tell you what, every property does sell in your business, but not every sale is created equal with the level of difficulty, work, and the quantity of leads you have to sort through. So I hope that helps for us in our business because we deal with a lot of recreational land that's typically large and not always with a residential use case in mind. We do not get a perk test on every single property, but I look for these cues and for these triggers. And as those boxes start to get ticked for our triggers, I will certainly spend the money and the time to get a perk test done. As I mentioned, we literally have a property in closing right now that is getting a perk test that is contingent on the closing to see if it passes, which based off of all of our analysis, there's no reason that shouldn't pass. And the last thing I'll say is a second opinion can go a long way. We've got a friend and a Leah member who recently did a deal with over $80,000 of spread on the deal. And this was a deal that people told him it will not perk. There's no way. It's been done before. It never passed. He said, you know what? I don't believe it because he knew the facts that we laid out here. He trusted his judgment. He went and ran a perk test on it on his own accord, risked $1,000 or whatever it was, and it came back, hey, will perk. You can get a septic system on there, and unlocked a boatload of value. Because again, he knew the facts. He said, I have a hunch based off of ticking enough of these boxes, and I'm going to proceed with essentially risking the $500, $1,000, $2,000, whatever it may be for the perk test, which ultimately that is your risk here. And those are shots that I'm typically willing to take if all the facts line up before. All right, guys, that is a bro's advice on perk tests for land investors. Hopefully that was helpful. I just wish someone just would have told me this in plain English when I first got started. Hope this helps, guys. Bye.